Honestly, it is so great and so important to be studying abroad. Hey guys, it's Kristen. I'm back today to tell you some more about traveling, and in particular, I'm going to be sharing some things you should know before you leave to study abroad. So I don't really have a definitive list, so I can't really tell you the number of things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to just start talking and see how much we get through. But I wanted to start with visas. So the most obvious thing before you leave your country to try to go to another country is you have to figure out if they're going to let you into that country. So you should do some research and find out if your passport, so the country you're coming from or the countries you have a passport for if you have more than one, find out if you need a visa to enter the country you're going to with that passport. And in particular, pay attention to the length of time you're going to be there and the purpose of your visit, because maybe they'll let you in, but if you're going to violate the terms of that, probably just travel visa allowance, a lot of places, for a lot of people, they'll let you in if you're just coming for a trip. But you want to be sure that you can be there for the length of time you're planning to study and with the purpose of studying. So you're probably going to need a visa. And for this, some tips. Start off by going to the embassy website or the consulate websites of the country that you're going to in your country. So if I'm going to study abroad in Korea, I find out about the Korean embassies here in the United States. And particularly I find the consulate, which would cover where I live or where I'm currently located. So for Northern California, for example, the consulate is in San Francisco. So I would go to that consulate's specific website and look at all of their visa information to find out what kind of visa I would need and also the requirements for applying and getting that visa. Also, you may very likely need to try and call the consulate if you can't find all of the information on their website, which can be stressful, but just be reassured that that's what a lot of people have to do. Also, if you're studying abroad, your school might help with this process. They might provide some of the information about particularly what kind of visa you're going to be on and potentially what you're going to need to get that visa. The next thing you need to worry about is currency. So when you go to a different country, unless you're within the EU with the euro, you're probably going to need a different currency. So for this, you're going to want to figure out, first of all, what the standard exchange rate is. What does Google say it is? And then you're going to want to look into how easy it is to get the currency, both in your country and in that country. So usually in the US, if you try to order a different currency within the United States, you're not going to get a great exchange rate, or they're going to charge you a lot of fees. So usually that's a suboptimal situation, but a lot of the time you're going to want to have cash at the airport, potentially to pay for your cab or whatever to get to where you're staying, because those don't often take card, or you shouldn't count on them taking an international card. So you're going to want to have cash pretty much on arrival. But the other option is to get that cash in the airport. Here you kind of have two options. There's usually a exchange counter, multiple exchange counters throughout the airport where you give them one kind of cash and they give you the other kind of cash. So for this, it can be good to have a certain amount of US dollars with you just in case, because cash exchange is almost always going to work. But also in the airport specifically, you tend to get a suboptimal exchange rate as well. The other option is to use an ATM in the airport when you arrive. Now, this tends to be a better exchange rate. The ATM will likely still charge you a fee, but it's probably going to be a baseline fee and not a percentage. So you can get a lot of money out and pay just $2 to $5 as your fee, which is probably better than getting a exchange rate that's going to scale as you get more and more money. The only problem is sometimes you can't count on airport ATMs having cash because there's tons of people arriving that also need money. So if they don't have a lot of ATMs, or if they're not stocked up all the time, they can often run out, which I've experienced. You also need to know what your bank card is how your bank card's going to affect the situation. So sometimes international cards won't work at all ATMs. Sometimes you need to find an international ATM. And at this point, it's also important to consider the bank you're using, particularly your debit card that you're using to try and get money out, whether they have a foreign transaction fee, and whether there are any kind of perks associated with ATM usage. So for example, I, non-spawn, use Charles Schwab, which has no foreign exchange fee. So that means when I get out a different currency, they don't charge me extra. I just get the exchange rate to that currency. And also, Charles Schwab refunds ATM fees. So when I'm at an ATM in India and it charges me 200 rupees to take out my cash every time, Charles Schwab will refund me that money at the end of the month. So if you're going to be gone for a long time, you think you're going to be making a lot of withdrawals, it might be worth looking into what kind of fees you're going to end up paying because of your bank and potentially opening a new account if you think it's going to be worth it. So that's basically the baseline of worrying about currency. The only other thing I would say is it's good to know how much the economy is cash-based, because that'll determine how much you are withdrawing money and how much you can just use your card, because foreign transaction fees will still apply when you're just using your card, but you won't have to pay those ATM fees. So usually it's better to try and just pay with card as much as you can, but a lot of places use cash more or use cash for certain things, so that's worth looking into. Third thing I wanted to talk about, which is finally getting more to being in the country, is airports and what to expect when you're going through customs in particular. So every country has a different customs procedure. You should expect to be handed some sort of form on the plane which will need to be filled out for you to enter the country. So that's both passport control, immigration, and customs. Customs is generally going to ask you what kind of goods you're bringing into the country. So usually, with some level of interpretation, as a student, you're not typically going to have to declare anything in customs, except maybe food. I had to declare food coming back to the United States because I brought some spices and tea from India, but usually they're looking for, do you have a massive amount of money or did you buy a lot of goods? Because the other thing that happens is sometimes they want to tax you if you bought something really expensive outside of the country and you're bringing it into the country. Coming back to the United States, they allow you like $800 worth of goods that you bought outside to bring in without having to potentially pay any sort of taxes. So that's something to keep in mind. But just make sure you fill out that form on the plane so that when you get off, it's really easy to just get in line and get through. And just generally follow signs. Some countries will be more organized than others. So entering Korea was pretty streamlined, very controlled, very similar to entering the United States. But entering India was complete like chaos. You just put yourself into lines all over the place. They were really messy, people were really jittery. And then getting through customs was like a really weird single security line for like hundreds of people. So your experience is going to depend, but generally just make sure you're filling out the forms honestly and following signage to go where you need to go, and you should be good, and just try not to stress it. That also applies to connecting flights. So one thing you may not realize is that when you're flying internationally, if you're making a transfer internationally, so I fly to London to fly to India, so I'm making a transfer in London, but I'm not entering the United Kingdom, I'm just going to another international flight, you will often have to go through security again still. So your connections will be slightly more stressful because you do have a bit more to do to get to your next flight, as opposed to just staying within a single country making a connection. You pretty much just wander over to the gate, and that's just because every country has different security standards and they want to make sure everyone getting on flights in their country meets those standards. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you're making a transfer from your international flight to a domestic flight, you will have to go through immigration and customs and then go out, basically. And in the United States, at least, you have to collect your luggage when you're going through customs and then recheck your luggage. And then you have to go back through security to get to the domestic flight. So for those transfers, make sure you have a decent amount of time. At least try to realize you've got several steps to go through and not like dilly-dally. But also, generally, airlines will be understanding if something gets delayed and you don't make your next flight, and they should just throw you on the next one. So try not to stress that too much. Now, getting more into being in the country. 4 thing to consider before you show up is how much of a language barrier you're going to face. This is going to depend not only on the country you're in, but where specifically in that country you're staying. But I have found that large cities and metropolitan areas, generally you can get by pretty well with English. If you don't speak English, I don't know how you're watching this video. It'll depend more on what the country you're in is and how common your native language is. But assuming you speak English, your accessibility is going to depend mainly on how large of a city you're staying in. Also, how common learning English is generally in that country. I found that a lot of countries now are requiring learning English. So, for example, in Korea, all of the younger generation has had to take English classes. So even if they're not fluent, they will understand basic things like where's the bathroom, ordering food, asking for directions by like pointing at a map. So that's good. Other countries, that might not be the case, so it might be a little more difficult. The other thing is that I really recommend learning at least some basics of the language of the country that you're going to be in, just to be able to show some level of respect to people by trying to speak their language and not just assuming that they will speak your language. And then depending on the culture, they might go towards English faster or not. But it's always good to try and learn the language. It's just not always feasible with your program or your background and how close that language is to other languages you know. So don't say, I have to know the whole language fluently, but do give it some level of effort. It's what I recommend. So next, I think we're on number 5. I wanted to talk about phone plans. So when you are in another country, you still want to have a functioning phone. You might think you can go without a functioning phone and just use Wi-Fi, but that is pretty limiting and it can be quite stressful depending on the country that you're in, because one of the main things you want a phone for in a foreign country is usually directions. And when you're out trying to get somewhere, it's a lot less likely that you will have Wi-Fi. It's also good to have in case of any sort of emergency to know that you'll be able to contact someone, which can take a lot of the stress out of new situations which you will constantly be in a new country. So I really strongly recommend getting a local phone number. But you can also do an international phone plan through your provider in your home country. So a lot of US providers do have some sort of international plan that you can get for some amount of talk, text, data. But as I was just saying with wanting to get directions, data is usually the most important thing. Also, if you want to be able to keep in touch with your family and friends back home, you can usually use messaging apps that go completely through data and don't use your phone number at all. I have usually used Facebook Messenger because that's pretty straightforward. You can also use Twitter and Instagram Messenger or a WhatsApp. I don't know how WhatsApp works. Everyone's into that, so I should probably know, but look into that. And so generally, it's easier to get the amount of data you want to have some freedom with a local card. By card, I mean SIM cards, so you replace the little card in your phone that gives you signal. For this, you're going to have to look into what the providers are in your country. I would try Googling stuff like SIM cards for international students, prepaid SIM cards in your country attached to the end, to find kind of the most basic plans where you can do a prepaid plan, which I find pretty useful if you don't know how much you're going to really be using it, or if you can find a really cheap standard monthly plan, that can also be good, which is what I did in India. I did a really cheap monthly plan that was really good. And in Korea, I did a prepaid plan, so I had to fill it back up a few times, but that was also much cheaper than any of the monthly plans would have ended up being. So depends on your options. Google around, you'll probably find something. But for that, you're probably going to have to actually go to the phone store and just get the SIM card, or sometimes you can order them online. I know there's a company in England that does completely online. Lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the aspects of a culture that I think are worth knowing before you go. First, within this subcategory is what the dressing standards are, particularly for females, I guess, but also for males, is how much of your body needs to be covered in public. Just having a general idea on that will give you some clue of what you should be packing. Second is how strangers generally treat each other. This is a good way to feel like you fit in and not feel too like other when you first arrive, because in the United States, for example, we are generally pretty friendly to strangers. We will smile at strangers. If we're standing in line, we might like make small talk with strangers. But in other countries, that's not really a thing, and it might be annoying if you tried to do that, or if you tried smiling at people and they didn't smile back, you might feel kind of hurt. So it's good to have your expectations set by doing a tiny bit of research. And this is the sort of thing that'll probably be covered in a general article about like culture of blank country, which are always good to read. Another thing is how loudness and quietness are treated. So like how angry people will be if you're loud at night. In India, people will call the cops if you're making too much noise at night. That's good to know. And also, like in Korea, it's really quiet on the subway, and if you're being really loud on the subway, you'll stand out. So it's kind of good to know just what those standards are, how they might differ during times of the day. Sorry, my throat's so sore if my voice keeps getting softer. But those are good things to either know beforehand or to try to notice when you first get there, because it'll kind of help you fit in, feel like you belong in this country, like you're not just some stupid foreigner. Finally, it's good to know what the transportation situation is in your country, and particularly if there are any apps you should get. Uber exists, but some countries have something like Uber that's actually used more, maybe cheaper. There's one called Ola in India. There might also be a situation where Google Maps is not entirely accurate for your country, where you need to get a local map service to get around. That happened in Seoul. Also, like food. Do some research on food, and particularly if they're into food delivery, if there are any apps for that. Also worth getting. Generally, just get any useful apps. You'll feel like well equipped. That is all I have written down right now. Definitely leave questions down below if you have any other questions about going abroad, or about anything I talked about or anything I didn't talk about. But I hope this was useful to you, and I hope you enjoy your time abroad. Thanks for watching. Bye! If you want to follow me on like social media, you can do that, I guess.